10 o'clock, but the clock up on the wall anyway. Want to welcome everybody here on a beautiful spring day. Things are certainly, flowers are popping out and things are starting to look great. I guess I don't really have a lot of as far as business. I will tell you that Roger, Carol, and Bradford left home early yesterday morning, and they got to Shreveport, Louisiana last night. Headed to Texas for about a week. 2 weeks. 2 weeks, that's right. 2 weeks. And so we'll see them back in a couple of weeks. But does anybody have announcements or anything that you want to share before we get?
I do.
All right.
I have a job.
Yeah.
I start Tuesday, and welcome. Yeah, you're here. You came in when they were applauding. Sorry. Yep. So I have a new job, and it's for I know, and it's for a company that audits bad actors for Medicare and Medicaid. And so a project that I'll be working on is there's a nursing shortage. So patients that are in ALFs and SNFs, they're being medicated to sleep instead of being taken care of because there aren't enough nurses. That's right, that is the face. Because there aren't enough nurses to take care of them. So I will be going and looking at the data and providing reports on who needs to be gone after, so that doesn't happen as much.
Do you go into the?
No. I look at all the stuff on the back end. So I'm gonna go catch some bad guys, y'all. Yay!
Okay. Other announcements.
Continued prayers for Mary Ann.
Yes.
And Jim just got over pneumonia, and he's well now, and but she just needs continued prayers.
Thank you. Okay, well, Sandy is going to be doing our lesson this morning, so we will get her up here, and we will do the fourth of this series on Simon Peter, and I will not deny you.
And you can start it. That's going to be
you're
our.
going to play. Okay.
Today, we're traveling to Jerusalem, and there we'll remember the events of the final hours of Jesus' life, from the Last Supper, to the Garden of Gethsemane, and finally to the high priest's house, where Peter denies knowing Jesus. Here we'll see in Peter's story a bit of our own story. So, let's go to Jerusalem.
So we've come to one of the locations where people remember the events that took place in the Last Supper, the upper room. There are several different locations that Christians have identified as possibilities for this. None of the buildings exist to this day, of course, but the place we're about to go into is it's where most people come to remember the Last Supper. So let's go to the upper room, probably built in the 1100s, maybe as late as the 1300s, and let's remember what happened when Jesus met with his disciples for the Last Supper. Let's go inside. So this is one possible location for the upper room. Jesus gathered with his disciples, and he transformed the Passover Seder meal into Holy Communion, or the Eucharist. And breaking the bread, he said, "This is my body." Taking the cup, "This is my blood of the new covenant." And this was his way of expressing both the covenant he was making with us and his saving work. And he gives them 3 commandments that night. We call this Maundy Thursday, 3 mandates. Love one another, serve one another, and remember me. After the supper was over, Jesus turned to Simon Peter in particular. He said, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you. And then he says, I pray that you wouldn't falter. But he implies that Simon would falter. He says, and then when you turn back, he says, strengthen your brothers. Simon Peter says, Lord, I would go anywhere with you. I would go to prison with you. I would die for you. And Jesus turns to him and says, Simon, tonight, before the cock crows, you'll deny knowing me 3 times. So we remember that part of the story of this place, and so much more in the upper room. But I want to take you to one of the other locations for the upper room, and we're going to remember the rest of the story there. So let's go. Excited to come here. This is the St. Mark's Convent and Church. It's the location, the Syrian Orthodox Church believes, the location of the upper room. It was first St. Mark's house and his mother's house, and it was there that the scripture tells us in the book of Acts that the early church gathered. It's thought that it was in their home that the disciples came for the experience of the Last Supper at the upper room, and where the early Christians met on the day of Pentecost. And so I want you to have a chance to see this place. I've never seen it myself, so I'm kind of excited to see it. And we're going to remember one more episode from the Last Supper. Let's go inside. The Syriac Orthodox Church believes this is the actual location of the upper room. This church built on top of it. I want to take you downstairs where we'll remember one more story from the Last Supper, the story captured in the painting behind me of the washing of the disciples' feet. Let's go downstairs and remember this story. So we come to the lower level of the Church of the Virgin Mary at St. Mark's Convent in Jerusalem. And this room once went far beyond this wall. There's another part of the room beyond this wall. It is believed by the Syrian Orthodox Church that this is actually the upper room. I want to remind you, we've considered the story of the Last Supper at the alternative site for the upper room. I want to remind you here of a second story. Jesus has just finished serving the supper, the meal, and he hears the disciples arguing with one another. What are they arguing about? Which one of us is the greatest? They still don't understand, after the Last Supper, that Jesus is going to die the next day. Which one of us is the greatest? After 3 years with Jesus in public ministry, they still don't understand which one of us is the greatest. And so Jesus says this, listen, the kings of this earth lord it over their subjects, but it's not going to be that way with you. The truly great among you will be your servants. In John's Gospel, he illustrates this in a profound way. As you may recall, there was water that was used to wash people's feet as they entered into a house. They took off their shoes, they washed their feet. The disciples entered this room, the upper room. There was a basin of water there, a towel, and no one washed their feet. Why? I think it was because each one thought, if I stop and wash my feet, Jesus is going to expect me to wash one of my brother's feet, and they would have been part of that. And so each one walked past the basin. Jesus gets up on the table. Remember, they're debating which one's the greatest. No one wants to be the servant. Jesus gets up on the table, and he goes and he picks up the basin of water, and he brings it to the disciples, and one by one he begins to wash their feet. He takes the water, washes their feet. They're horrified. I mean, this is not the way it should be. Jesus is our master, and he's washing our feet. But no one says a word until Jesus comes to Simon Peter. And Simon Peter speaks up, and he says, no, Lord, you will not wash my feet. And Jesus says, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part of me. And so Simon Peter says, well, then my head and my hands too, Lord. And Jesus says, no, your feet, that's enough. And then when he's finished washing each of the disciples' feet, Peter's and the other disciples' feet, Jesus turns to them and says, do you understand what I've done for you? You call me your master, you call me your teacher and your master, and that is what I am. And I have washed your feet. I played the role of the servant to wash your feet. If I have washed your feet, how much more should you wash one another's feet? And in this moment, he's teaching them something profound. Just before that story, John says he now showed them the full extent of his love by serving. And of course, this was just a picture of what he'd do on the cross the next day. He would serve the human race by laying down his life. And what he calls us to be and to do, which is precisely what Peter finally understood after the crucifixion and the resurrection. After the supper was over, Jesus led the disciples
through the Kidron Valley to the Garden of Gethsemane. Let's go there now. So this is the grove of olive trees called the Garden of Gethsemane. You'll notice that some of the trees are very, very old. Some believe they're as old as 2,000 years. And Jesus brought his disciples here, had some of them remain in a vicinity around here, and he took Peter, James, and John further into the garden. And then from there, he said, you stay and wait and pray here. And he went a stone's throw beyond that to where the church, or the Basilica of Christ's Agony, the Church of All Nations is. We're going to go inside there and take a look. But I wanted you to see this beautiful grove of olive trees and imagine the events happening here where the disciples are praying in this garden, where Jesus is coming to agonize before he's arrested. Let's go inside the church. It's architecturally designed so that you feel like you're walking into the event that this building commemorates. You're walking into the Garden of Gethsemane, literally in that place, and you are commemorating, you're remembering, and really stepping back 2,000 years in time to that night. If you look up into the ceiling, you'll see the columns of trees, and they branch out into branches in the ceiling. You'll see the stars that are there from that night, so you're going back to that night. So you'll notice that the church is built on this rock outcropping. So throughout the room you can see in the foundations, you can see the rock here and here, and of course on every side. This church was built on top of this holy shrine. So the rock itself, the place where Jesus came to pray, the traditional location of that is the holy site, the place where once more in his agony Christ prayed, not my will, but thy will be done. Let's go back outside into the garden, and let's remember what happened when Jesus prayed 3 times here and 3 times returned to the garden. So Jesus returns from the place where he was praying, and he finds Peter, along with James and John, fast asleep. He awakens him and says, couldn't you wait with me for 1 hour, keeping watch? He goes to pray again. He comes back once more, and he finds them asleep. One more time, he goes back to pray. He comes back from his prayer of agony, and he finds them asleep. And he says to them this. So we find Peter sleeping 3 times here in this garden. But Jesus shows grace once more. He says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. I realize that your heart wants to be awake, and I understand you're very tired. And at that moment, Judas Iscariot comes with the guard. He kisses Jesus, betraying him with a kiss. Simon Peter, what does he do? He takes out his sword, and he's ready to fight. And he slashes the ear of the high priest's servant. And as he slashes the ear of the high priest's servant, Jesus stops and says, listen, those who live by the sword will die by the sword. You've heard this phrase before. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. And Jesus then takes the man's ear and heals him. And at that, the disciples flee. They leave in terror. Peter starts to fight, and then at that moment, he runs away in fear. I want you to recognize something once more about Peter. He falls asleep, and yet Jesus shows him grace. 3 times he falls asleep. Jesus shows him grace. I want you to notice that he's the only one who took out a sword to fight. None of the others did. Peter takes out a sword to fight. But once Jesus says, no, we're not going to fight, Peter, along with the other disciples, all flee. They all desert Jesus, just as Jesus had foretold. As Jesus is arrested, the guard takes him to the Kidron Valley, through the Kidron Valley, to the high priest's house. Let's walk through the Kidron Valley together now. Let's go. So we've come through the Kidron Valley. Jesus arrested, being taken in chains, to the house of the high priest, where the Sanhedrin will gather for the trial by night. It's in the middle of the night, midnight, or 1 o'clock in the morning. The disciples have fled, except Peter and John, who are following in the darkness, in the distance, following Jesus as he's going to the place of his trial. When I come through this in the Kidron Valley, I love these tombs that are here in the background. These are very ancient tombs, and in my mind, of course, people have been buried here on the Mount of Olives for a very long time. As those tombs were there, I imagine Jesus walking through here, and in my mind, I think the one who is the resurrection and the life is walking through this place. I wonder if the bones were rattling inside those tombs when Christ walked through here.
as he ascends these stairs and makes his way before his trial before Caiaphas and the Jewish ruling council. Let's continue on our way. Christians come to these steps when they're retracing the journey of Jesus in the last 24 hours of his life. These steps are believed to be from the Roman period, from the time of Christ. And you can see them going on downhill and on to the Kidron Valley. So this would have been the path that was taken from the Kidron Valley to the high priest's house, Caiaphas' house, where Jesus was brought by trial that night to be tried before the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin. Christians will often take off their shoes and walk barefoot on these steps, imagining that they are actually touching the stones that Jesus himself walked on that terrible night. But it wasn't, of course, only Jesus who walked on these steps. Simon Peter and John were hiding in the distance. They were following from a distance, and they too walked up these steps. And it's Peter's journey here at this site that Christians remember. We're standing on the grounds of the Church of St. Peter in Gallicantia, the Church of St. Peter and the Cock Crowing. And I want to explore this church together with you and show you a little bit of what's here, and then to remember the story of Peter's greatest failure. It happened right here. First, however, I want to pause and pray as I'm walking up these steps, just silently, and remember that Christ also walked these steps, and that, like Peter, I often follow poorly in Christ's footsteps. So this building is built on an ancient archaeological site, believed to be the hall where the Jewish ruling council, the Sanhedrin, met that night when Christ was sentenced to die, and also an ancient prison. And the sanctuary tells the story of the last 24 hours of Jesus' life. Let's take a look. So this large hall, you can still see the original foundation stones, or really the stones around which this building was built. It's thought to be perhaps the gathering place of the Sanhedrin, where Jesus was put on trial and where he was sentenced to die. Just outside of this room is the courtyard where Simon Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times. And so I think it's a great opportunity to look and just imagine the story when I bring people here. What's interesting is there is an opening in the floor here, so what looks like an old well. But as you approach it, you can see the hole goes all the way down into the pit in the bowels of the building. And underneath this section of the building, you find what appears to be an ancient prison, a place where prisoners were kept and shackled. And then beneath that, even still, is a pit, what might have been an ancient cistern, probably an ancient cistern, but which was used as a prison. And what happened was, in the ancient world, often these kind of openings, these kind of cisterns would be used as prisons when they were dry. And the prisoner would have ropes put around his chest and lowered down into the pit and then raised back up. So pilgrims come down here into the pit. These steps, of course, weren't here in the 1st century, but you come down here and typically large groups gather in here. And I've sat in the darkness sometimes in this room and I've pondered the words that Jesus might have been thinking as he was hearing the Sanhedrin debating his fate above. I invite people to just pause and remember as they're here the life experiences that we have when we're in the pit and we feel like life is hopeless. We've come down to the place where the church remembers, where Christians remember the moment of Peter's greatest failure. It was here in the courtyard of the high priest's house while Jesus was on trial and being sentenced, or about to be sentenced to death, that Simon Peter, warming himself by the fire, is asked by a stranger who's standing there, "You were one of Jesus' disciples too, weren't you?" And he cries out, "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know the man." A second time, someone comes to him and says, "No, you were one of his disciples. We know you were." And he says, "I don't know him. I don't know what you're talking about." A third time, someone comes to him and says, "No, we know you were one of Jesus' disciples." And he begins to curse and swear and says, "I never knew the man." And at that moment, the cock crows. And one gospel tells us that Jesus looked through the opening, maybe the entrance to the high priest's house, to the courtyard, and his eyes met Peter's gaze, and Peter begins to weep unconsolably. Now, when the Gospels were written, Simon Peter had already died. He was the hero of the church. He was the rock upon which the church was built, the leading apostle. How is it that all 4 of the Gospels would tell the story? They don't want to embarrass Simon Peter. Nobody would do that. So why is this story recorded in all four Gospels? Why is it that across the church everyone knew the story? It was not for the fact that Simon Peter must have told the story over and over and over again. Wherever he preached, he would have told the story. I denied the Lord. On the night that he was sentenced to die, I denied him 3 times. And yet he took me back. And if he took me back, he can take you back. And continue to work through you and use you and use even your weakness as a testimony to his grace and mercy. This moment of Peter's greatest failure became the testimony that he gave across the world, I believe, to God's grace and mercy. And in it, it helped ordinary Christians who also would deny Jesus again and again and again to find hope. Each of us deny the Lord in our thoughts, in our words, in our deeds, by what we've done and by what we've left undone. And if there was hope for Simon Peter, there's hope for us as well. You may have denied the Lord. His grace is sufficient for you, and he will use you. And even the testimony about the moments of your weakness to help others understand who he is and the magnificence of his grace.
Let's pray. Lord, you know how, like Peter, we often fail to understand. Sometimes we fall asleep when you need us to stay awake. And at moments, by our words or our actions, we deny even knowing you. Please forgive us, Lord, right now. Make us clean and new once more, and help us to faithfully walk with you. In your holy name, amen.
Okay, so that was the lesson. After I looked at it, I thought, okay, what more can be said? It was such an extraordinary video, I thought. What stood out to you about seeing those places in the Holy Land?
Well, I thought it was just a great presentation, you know, a timeline, you know, as good as I've ever seen and heard.
I thought so too. It made me regret those of us who never had the opportunity at this point to go, you know, with the latest crisis. I don't know when we might have the opportunity. Wouldn't you love to do that? Some things that stood out, the pit, the cistern, you know, I've read about that, but I never saw a diagram. Can you imagine hearing them crucify him from above? I thought it was a powerful video. Anything else, Kathy?
I think this is the best of the series that I've seen him do. There's something, I don't know, that to me this is the best. The meaning of him walking barefooted, you know, with bare feet where Jesus stepped, you know, that was powerful.
I thought so too, and as I said, but after I looked at it, I thought, okay, what more can be said? So we will talk a little bit about what else we can talk about today. But of course, most of our lesson today focuses on Peter's denial, and even though he did touch on the washing of the feet, and he clearly tells the disciples, if I, your Lord and teacher, wash your feet, then you must wash each other's. And I have given you an example, just as I have done, you must also do. And of course, his lesson goes deeper than that, because he says the greatest among you must become like a person of lower status and a leader like a servant. So I love Peter's reaction. This happens so often. What Peter does enables Jesus to drive his message home, I think, more thoroughly than if he just said, you know, Peter is always questioning, or, you know, it was like during the, who do you say I am? You know, Peter answers, and Jesus is able to elaborate. Peter's the one who gets out of the boat, walks on water for a ways, and Jesus, that message that to keep our eyes on him will keep us afloat. And so many times, Peter's reaction is what helps us to learn what Jesus' message really is. In our culture, well, Adam Hamilton says that servant leadership is the key to everything, every relationship. What do you think about that statement? He mentions his marriage, serving each other, keeps it strong. How about with employees, employers? Many of the successful companies, the leadership serves, and the employees realize that. Don't you think? So I tend to agree with him on that. So how do you feel when you take on the role of a servant? Anybody want to share?
I think it's like one of the greatest joys you can ever do is when you're doing something for others. I don't know anything that makes your heart feel any better.
I think so. And then when,
I spent 20 years as a scoutmaster, and you know, you think about
yes, you did.
how much time you invest in kids, all the camping trips and stuff. It's just giving back, you know, things that you may have enjoyed as a kid.
Exactly. Ken, and then,
Helping others helps each of us, because the more we help someone else, the more we offer service of ourselves, the more I think we realize how it makes us feel to be able to give somebody something else, but we also feel that it makes us feel like we're an important part of life, and that's good for everybody.
What solidifies what he said, I was a teacher, retired teacher, and a coach. And to this day, to go out in public, and then one of them comes up to you, it solidifies what you were chosen to do, because I always felt I was called to do that as a profession. And, it just makes you feel really good when somebody else comes up to you and says, and they tell you, you know, that you had impacted them in some positive manner. Not necessarily something outstanding, but it kind of solidifies it.
I think you teachers, you certainly are servants, but I've been with friends who are retired teachers, and it's wonderful to see their students coming up and speaking to them and telling them what a difference they made, so that's wonderful.
I struggle to let other people be the servant, right? So like Simon Peter was like, oh no, please don't, like I will do your feet, don't do mine. I would really struggle with somebody trying to help, because you guys have, like, so, I won't call, but like some of you guys have all helped me in the last 60 days as I've been dealing with all this crap, and it's been really hard. I'm like, I'll pay you back, like I don't need it, like it's okay, and I've prevented people from being able to serve, and that's a shortcoming on my part.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Simon Peter had that situation, and I think we all do. How do we feel when we're on the receiving end? Sometimes it's difficult to be on the receiving end.
And I would reiterate that is hard sometimes to accept help gracefully, and you know, it reminds us that by accepting the help, we are allowing someone else to give.
That's a good point to make. Well, I'm going to read the Bible passage from today. It's Matthew 26, verses 31 through 35. And then we'll go on to some characteristics of Jesus and Peter. Then Jesus said to them, every one of you will be made to stumble because of me during this night. For it is written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock shall be scattered abroad. But after I have been raised, I will go before you into Galilee. Peter answered him, if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. Jesus said to him, this is the truth I tell you. During this night, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. So also spoke all the disciples. So in this passage, there are some characteristics of Jesus that stand out, and I'm just going to share those. I, as I always do, look up Barclay's commentary before I lead a lesson to see what he says about the Bible first. And he said, one of the characteristics that stands out about Jesus is his realism. He knew what lay ahead, but he carried on. The flight of his disciples was foretold in Zechariah. And verse 13:7 says, sword, arise against my shepherd, against the man responsible for my community, says the Lord of heavenly forces. Strike the shepherd in order to scatter the flock. So he knew, but he carried on. And Jesus' confidence, what does he say? He says, I'll see you in Galilee. And then his empathy, or his sympathy. He knew that the men would flee, they would abandon him, but he doesn't condemn them, though, does he? He loves, He knows that he will meet them again, and the mistakes and failures of their humanity doesn't turn his love from them at all to contempt or anger or anything. He has sympathy, empathy for his men. But what does it say about Peter as well? What does it say about his confidence? So I am going to stand with you even if I have to die. But overconfident, right? And so our author says that even though he thought he could face anything, a little humility about his weakness might have led to greater dependence on God, and that's a lesson for us. Just to confess our weaknesses and depend on God. And what else do we know about Peter? You know, he may have denied Christ, but how courageous was he? See, he was the one ready to fight when Jesus was betrayed, wasn't he? Even to the point of cutting off Malchus' ear. And then who followed him through the valley and over to the Caiaphas house? Maybe he stayed in the shadows, but who followed him? Peter and John. But the high priest house, he would have been wealthy, and in Palestine at that time, the homes of wealthy people were built around, there was a hollow square in the middle, and then various rooms that would have opened onto that square. So he was walking right into danger by going into that courtyard. And if you'll bear with me and hear this passage from Matthew 26 further. It says, those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Peter followed them at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest's house, and he went inside and sat down with the servants to see the end. Peter was sitting in the courtyard. A maidservant came up to him and said, you too were with Jesus of Galilee. He denied it in the presence of them all. I do not know him, he said. What are you saying? When he went out to the porch, another maidservant saw him and said to those who were there, this man too was with Jesus of Nazareth. And again he denied it. I do not know the man. A little later, those who were standing there said to Peter, truly, you too were one of them, for your accent gives you away. Then he began to curse and to swear. I do not know the man. And immediately the cock crowed. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus when he said, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. Barclay, in his commentary on Matthew, calls this passage staggeringly honest. And you saw what Adam Hamilton had to say, that Peter must have made this story essential to his ministry. It's told in all the Gospels, and not all the stories of the last week are told in all the Gospels. And it's told particularly vividly in Mark. Some scholars say that Mark's Gospel is made up of the preaching material of Peter, just written down. So, in any case, we know that Peter and his denial is told everywhere, and everybody knows it because Peter himself told it. And think about this. Each time he told the story, he could say, this is the way Jesus forgives. He forgave me when I failed him in his bitterest hour of need. He took me, Peter, the coward, and used even me. And one more thing to say about Peter, I love this, and this is, I get confused about which book I read it in, Adam Hamilton's or Barclay's, but anyway, whatever, I think it's good. It says, it was love that gave Peter the courage to be in that courtyard at all. It was love that made him remember Jesus' words to him. It was love that sent him out in the night to weep. And it's love that covers a multitude of sins. So would any of us had the kind of courage that took that fierce love of Christ? How many of you read this book this week? I don't want to repeat if everybody did. But if you didn't, there's a couple stories in the book that I think are important that I'll summarize really quickly, but we have just a few minutes. That I think may cause us to think. It certainly did me. I thought they were fascinating. One is about a man who was working at an IGA grocery store in St. Joseph's, Missouri in 1933. And he said there was a crowd as many as 7,000 of his friends and neighbors and others who gathered at the town's jail. They'd come for a 19-year-old black man who was accused of raping a 21-year-old white woman, and the man's name was Lloyd Warner. While interrogated, he confessed, but later recanted his confession. The young woman was certain it was Warner, and then she was not certain, then she was certain again. And, but anyway, he was tried, was to be tried, but for the crowd, these 12 ringleaders didn't want to wait for the criminal justice system. So this young man who worked at the IGA store, Mr. Plummer, stood at the edge of the crowd watching to see what would happen. And after law enforcement attempted to prevent Mr. Warner's abduction, the ringleaders were taken to Warner, and he was dragged out of the courthouse, beaten, and then hung. And this is harsh. They drenched his body in gasoline and lit him on fire. And so Adam Hamilton says, as he writes these words, he's looking at a photograph of the men standing over the smoldering body of Lord Warner. Plummer, the IGA employee, told the experience 30 years later in a sermon he was preaching at, he was a lay leader at Frankfort Methodist Church, and his sermon was called Standing on the Edge of the Crowd. And despite the uncertain circumstances of Mr. Warner's confession, or the uncertain identification of the man by the victim of the rape, and despite the lack of a trial, these men felt justified in doing what they had done, and no one in the crowd protested. A crowd filled with church-going Christians did not protest. Plummer, a gentle giant of a man, described 30 years of remorse and shame for not having spoken up. It was a heart-wrenching story. Would we have spoken up? Enough people felt remorse about his death that was the last lynching in St. Joseph, Missouri, but none of them spoke at the time. But we're reminded by Adam Hamilton that we've all stood by at a lynching at some point or another in some way, where we were too afraid to stand up in the face of injustice, or stand up to a bully, or work to resist what was evil. So it brought back to me, I wrote a paper years ago, and you all have discussed Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was put to death by the Nazis for standing up. And I remember writing that paper and struggling so with that, thinking, I could never do that. I could never be that brave. So anyway, terrible story.
The strongest human instinct is survival. So when Jesus was able to override that instinct, he probably knew that Peter and the rest of the disciples may not be able to do that. It's very rare in human history that we find people who are able to override that instinct of survival.
I think that's why Dietrich Bonhoeffer's name comes to us after all these years, don't you think? And there are people. But Peter's story shows us that we need not be defined by our failures. God does not define us by the worst thing we did. He makes amazing use of our flaws and continually invites us back, forgives and restores us. And then there's one more story that he shared. This gentleman pastored a large United Methodist church in Florida, Jorge Acevedo. Maybe you're familiar with him. I believe, we don't have Margaret here, but I believe he was one of the the pastors who did some of the video introductions to Disciple Bible Study. I'm pretty sure. But anyway, he told that this is about vulnerability and about a flaw that became that God used. He said that he was, before communion one day during a worship service, he admitted he had struggled with alcoholism. During his invitation to the Lord's Supper, he said, "So if you struggle with alcohol like I do, then please know this is a safe place for you." And he said he didn't realize that he was outing himself as a person in recovery that day. And some people were shocked, But he said a funny thing happened. Everyone in church that day who was an alcoholic or who struggled with some kind of addiction went out and found their friends who struggled and said, you gotta come to church with me. My pastor knows what it's like to struggle. And so he said, today more than 1,000 people gather every week at one of the 5 campuses of that church to participate in their 12-step program. So our flaws and our vulnerability can bring others to Christ as well. So I just wanted to share those 2 stories. I think they have an impact and can have an impact on us. So maybe close with prayer. Oh, do we have questions or comments? Okay. Yeah, sure. Sorry.
So in Bible times, did they have to have a warrant to be able to arrest Jesus, or did they just decide, like the lynching guy, just to do civilian justice?
I don't know. See, the religious leaders were
Exempt?
no, I won't say that. They were the ones, he preached all week in the temple and they were really angry with him. I think Rome, because of their laws, possibly could have required that sort of thing, but they were saying, okay, let's not cause a riot among all these Jewish people who were so angry with Jesus. And, like Pilate just washed his hands at the whole thing. They didn't want to be involved. So I would say the justice system probably did not want to get involved if there was such a thing as a warrant. I don't know. Does anybody know that?
I don't know. Ha ha ha. Okay, so so if Peter had admitted this lynch mob, basically, of Jewish leaders, they would have gone after him, or the Roman people would have gone after him, or what would be his motivation to deny it? Because after they had Jesus, who was the one they were targeting.
Well, from what I've read, there's quite a rabble, and we saw this story in Missouri. There's mob mentality. And you heard the crowd when they were calling, crucify him. So possibly anybody connected with him would have been painted with that same brush at the time. I don't know. I mean, I think I would have been nervous about the Sanhedrin and all of the people,
But do you think that they realized that it would escalate to the point where the Sanhedrin would say, hey, Rome, go do the things, and then everybody would agree to crucify, like Peter would know, because he didn't know what was going to happen at the time, right? He was just saying, no, I don't know this dude. He didn't know that the Sanhedrin would then go to Rome, and then the hands, and then crucifixion, right? So what was he afraid of that would happen?
I don't know if he was out in the courtyard during the time when they were having the trial inside. He may have known, or it may have been such a common occurrence for those who were going against the establishment. That he would have guessed or probably realized what was going to happen.
So
Who knows? It may have sunk in at that time that what Jesus said. I'm going to die. I'm going to suffer. Yeah, that's right. Ken, can you shed some light on this?
Well, I think if you look at Jewish law and you look at Roman law, and the idea of who was absolutely in control, the Romans were absolutely in control, and the Jewish leaders, high priest, etc., that reported to Rome wanted to keep Rome happy. The Jewish leaders did not want anybody who was speaking out against, as you mentioned, what was seen as the status quo at that time. And truly in those days, much like in the Wild West of our country, hanging somebody, crucifying somebody was the way to go if somebody was really different than somebody else, if somebody spoke out than somebody else. And here you had someone who had so many followers, some people who really believed in the kingdom of God and that this was the Savior, this was the Messiah. They Rome certainly didn't want to deal with that. The Jewish leaders didn't want to deal with that because they were going to lose their favor, and they were going to lose their money, they were going to lose their jobs. So, and, you know, power and control. So the bottom line was, hey, we can't have this person doing what they're doing, so let's make sure he disappears.
Exactly.
So what do you do now to stand up for stuff? Because like, reality is that that's just happening now. People that are speaking out on behalf of Palestine, and I don't care where you stand, I'm just making a statement. They are being like taken literally off the streets by like ICE and immigration. So how do you stop that? Like you see somebody getting arrested on the side of the road that's, you know, it's like we saw it on camera where students at Hopkins are being taken by immigration. So what do you do? How do you not be a bystander? Like I wouldn't know what to do in that situation. I see somebody being taken off the side of the road. Like I don't know what to do. Do I go and get in between them?
But you don't know all the circumstances.
I don't, but neither did they, you know?
That's right, so you just.
This will be a conversation for after class.
Sorry.
And so, we're gonna close with a prayer, okay? Loving and forgiving God, we come before you with repentant and thankful hearts. We know that we are both flawed and faithful like Peter. Forgive us for the times that we deny you or the times that we fail to serve others in your name. Thank you for your never-ending love and grace-filled forgiveness. Give us courage, strength, guidance, and direction as we continue to be your faithful, flawed disciples. Amen. I would recommend I put your name.
All right.
So what's happened with you?
I read what happened to, or I see him on Facebook every Sunday morning and Tuesday night.
I don't know what I did.
See, I'm interested.
Well, I don't know what